Today, Dr. Peter Bosted, Director of the Cave Conservancy of Hawaii, will be presenting his research on mapping and documentation of the lava tubes in uwa awa. His research has been done through a permit with the HETF, and please note that permits are required to enter caves in uwa awa. Okay, whenever you're ready, Peter, you can take the floor.
Thank you, Olivia.
No problem.
So I'd like to just launch right into my presentation. So where are we talking about? Well, this is the big island of Hawaii, and the square shows the area where uwa awa is located. And it's on the mountain of Hualālai. There's the summit of Hualālai there, and the flows that come down to the northwest are the ones that of interest today. So this is just a Google Earth imagery showing that there's lots of pit craters and things up at the top of Hualālai. This is more or less the summit of Hualālai volcano, and as you come down the slope, these long flows have come down all the way to the ocean, some of them. And we have two major areas of caves. This one here, which is the big focus of my talk, is on this area, which is above Highway at 190. I'll kind of refer to that. And then there's a lot of caves below Highway 190 as well. The longest one is this one here, called Pueo Cave. And finally, there's one cave in a much older flow that didn't get covered over, and it's called Umini Manu Cave, and it's that means bird trap. So that was one that I'm not going to talk about today, but it's very interesting because it's one of the other locations where bird bones have been found. So let's just take a quick look at our landscape, what we're talking about. This is a picture that shows about half of the study area looking out towards Kiholo Bay, and this is Pu'uanahulu. The Pu'uwa game management area is incorporated into this, and so we've also been studying caves in this Ahupua of Pu'uanahulu, and I'll have a few pictures of those caves as well that were done under an earlier permit when we had all three areas on our permit. And as you can see, the top of the landscape is more or less pasture land here. We're below the forest bird sanctuary, and it goes down all the way to the ocean where it gets much flatter, and you have grasslands like this. And the grasslands are generally over very rough like lava, so they're quite difficult to walk in, and they're a little bit dangerous because they're full of holes in the ground that lead into the lava tubes, and it's possible to fall in one like I did 2 weeks ago, and I'm still suffering from a very, very sore foot. So as we go up into the pasture lands above the highway, it's still being ranched with cattle. They're slowly trying to move the cattle away, but it takes time because if they all go all at once, we might have gigantic forest fires. So it's kind of fun to be caving with the cows most of the time that I'm up there. And there's some cute little calves and water troughs and things. As we go further up the mountain towards the summit of Hualālai, this is a view looking from the road above the forest bird sanctuary. We're actually looking at Mauna Kea in the background there with its telescopes on the top, I think. Anyway, you can see the bird sanctuary was an area that was ranched long ago, but something like 30 or 40 years ago it was set aside for preservation. And all the cattle were removed, and the forest has been growing back quite well. It's also an area where there's still a lot of pigs that are a nuisance and slowly being removed. And of course they have beautiful lehua blossoms on the trees. So this is a picture on the east side of the forest bird sanctuary, which is to our left, and this is the Shangri-La area on the right. And what you can see is a dramatic contrast. Oh, this is uwa awa itself here, this mountain. And so we're looking down on it. This is a very old cinder cone, about 120,000 years old, whereas these lava flows are in the 1 to 10,000 year range. But I just wanted to again point out the dramatic contrast on this side of the pig fence, where there's no cattle and not that many pigs. The trees have been growing back very nicely over 30 to 40 years. And the goal of future management projects is to make this area look like that area. So here's some friends that joined a tree planting trip. They were all cave explorers from Georgia that came out and helped plant koa trees. So slowly by slowly, we want to restore the area so that it's full of these beautiful big koa trees. And part of the ecology of the area is that there's a cloud forest that comes in almost every afternoon. The clouds come in and make for a dry ohia forest, but yet it has moisture that comes in the form of fog and light rain almost every single day. So now, a little bit about the history. I don't know what happened before 1990, but there may have been some ancient Hawaiian exploration, but we've only seen mild evidence of it, and only almost all of it's below Highway 190, which is not my study area. So more recently, in the 1990 or so, John Giffen, whose I see is listening in, the manager at the time, located at several hundred entrances and made a line plot showing where he thought the caves were going underground. He named the various caves that lined up with each other after some rare plants such as Delissea ambigua and Ahupua. So here is John actually looking in a cave on another area of Hualālai, and he's helping to identify some rare plants on this property. And so I should go back and quickly mention that Delissea was thought to be extinct. It's a kind of tree, and John found one example, and it's now gone, now died, but he collected it and it's being propagated, and there's several hundred individual Delissea trees now. So we decided to name the big cave system after that amazing discovery of the Delissea. So John invited some cavers to help him make detailed maps of the cave, and the first one above the highway was Ambigua Cave. And here's a map. There was a typical map with a plan view showing what it looks like from the top, and a side view looking from the profile view, so you can generally get an idea of what the cave passages look like and what's inside them. And this is just one page out of 8. So Ambigua Cave was one of the most important caves because it was one where a lot of bird bones were found by John, and then he brought in people from the Smithsonian like Helen James, and they collected them and studied them. And what happens is these now extinct bird species were generally flightless, so they would get chased or somehow fall into a skylight opening like this, fall down 30 feet, and have no way out. So they would just expire, and it's a great place to look for fossil bird bones. In the more modern history, the mapping and photography of the system above Highway 90, which is my project area really, began in earnest in 2011. And Doug Medville, who was the PI at the time, continued mapping caves below 190, which he'd started a little bit earlier. And he continues doing to this day. So let's take a look around at what do these entrances look like. Well, they range from lots and lots of very small entrances. This is very similar to the one that I fell in 2 weeks ago. It was absolutely covered in ferns and brush, and I didn't see it. And down I went. And but nonetheless, these small entrances can lead to big caves. This is a sort of more typical moderate size entrance. This is below Highway 190, and you can see it's all covered in fountain grass, and the caves are much drier looking, and the floors aren't so covered in trees and ferns as they are up higher. When we get up higher, we We have smaller entrances, and you can see in many places the roof of the cave is very thin. So we have actually a double entrance with a very thin bridge. Personally, I would not walk on that bridge. There have been cases where all of a sudden they give way and people disappear. So it's part of the hazards of this environment. And other places, the ceiling is much thicker, or the roof between the roof of the cave and the surface is much thicker. But you do start to get things like vines coming in, and then some interesting plants, lots various grasses. This is a roadside entrance. So one of the interesting things about these caves is there are lots and lots of passages, and they do tend to go under the roads. But on the other hand, it's convenient when there is a road nearby, so we can just pop on in. So up higher, there's some very large entrances. This is one of the larger ones. As you can see, it's like maybe 50 foot in diameter. It's actually completely overhanging on all sides, and the only way to get in this one would be to jump and not get out again, but luckily there's a walk-in entrance not too far away. And as you can see in these big deep pukas, we have a lot of growth. Typically the trees grow much taller. The ferns are much more abundant because there's a lot more moisture. And I'm not a plant person, so I don't know, but I know from John's work that very often these environments can harbor the rare trees and plants that haven't been eaten and trampled by all the cattle and pigs and things, because they're relatively protected here, not only from the weather, but from the ungulates. Here's another example of a multi-leveled passage, one above the other. And we have lots of mosses and ferns as well, all kinds of mosses, some of which might be rare, I don't know. I know that there is one type of fern that's federally endangered that is found in the only pretty much found in lava tubes. But it's very hard to tell it apart from all the other ferns, not being an expert. Anyway, often you get tree roots coming right into the cave from near an entrance, and some of them can be really big. Lots of ferns and things, lots of interesting kinds of mosses and things. These are all in the entrance zones where there's still sunlight. As soon as you get in the total dark zone, we don't get any more green plants. This is one of the more prolific abundances of ferns. And in particular, the hapu'u, the tree fern, is pretty much only found in these pukas, as we call them, cave entrances or holes. And I don't know what this type of fern is, but it's pretty nice looking. And we get up to higher elevations. This is up maybe near 6,000 feet. We tend to get big entrances most of the time, huge passages, with again some native bushes like a'ali'i and pukiawe that you find on the surface are also found just inside the caves. And one last entrance. This is one of the few cases where I've seen an obvious modification of an entrance. This is at around 3,000 feet, and somebody made a ramp down into this cave, and there's a big flat area down there. And kind of guessing it was used in the ranching era for some purpose or another. But maybe John will know. So generally, now I'm going to talk about mapping, since that's sort of the title of my talk is mapping and documentation. So what we do is we go and find all these entrances. We started with John's list, and since then we've found about at least 800 more entrances, pretty much going from one entrance to another. And to make a map of the cave, we have this new fancy instrument that's been around for a few years now. That's this red thing in the caver's hand. And basically we establish survey points. So that this is one survey station, and we measure from one point to another point with this device that shoots out a laser. And you press the button and it gives you the distance to the other station, as well as the compass bearing and the inclination. So these are actually custom made by cave explorers because you can't buy a handy dandy unit like this commercially. And we also measure the distance to the walls, and then and the ceiling and the floor and take a bunch of other auxiliary measurements and write them all down in a book. Some people, yeah, that's how we do it. We write it all down in a book. We write all the numbers down, and on the other page we make a drawing of what the cave looks like in the plan view and the profile view. So when it's all said and done, we can start putting together maps of the various caves. So this is the cover page of the Atlas of Pueo Cave, which is just below the highway. And you can see it's too big to fit on one sheet, so he divided it up into 5 sheets, put a list of all the symbols that we use in there, and some other descriptive information. So this is like what a typical cave map looks like in the plan view. It has, again, the passage walls and then symbols that show what the floors look like in terms of, are they rocks or smooth floor or rough floor, and other features, and then these cross-sectional views as well. And there's also the ceiling heights in numbers, so you can kind of gauge whether you could walk or whether you're going to be on your belly. So most of my work has been on the Delissea cave system, which is now about 70% of all the caves mapped in the area. And this shows an earlier map showing how originally several different caves that John had named, like Hapuu, Petrel, well, it's not connected, Pig Fence, Ambigua, and Delissea, we started mapping them and we found that they're much more ramified with many, many parallel passages, and also we were able to join them together underground and more or less make one big long system. There are some little gaps here and there, but as you can see, it covers just an area, an extent of about 4 miles on this map, but yet there's like 50 miles of passages shown on this map. So there's lots of what I call multiplicity, so parallel passages on top of each other. And one interesting thing is if you look at the profile, this profile shows that the average slope near the top is almost 27 degrees. And that, in the world of lava tubes, is exceptionally steep. So that accounts for a lot of the interesting features of the cave, is the fact that it's on such a steep slope. Most lava tubes are on much shallower slopes. And here's a map of a portion of the Delissea system shown here. So here's the whole system, and then that's the portion that this particular map covers. So in this case, we started making very detailed maps of different sections of the cave. And so you can see on this plan view here that it's amazingly complicated with something well over 15 different passages if you slice it across this way. So it's very complicated. Some of these are above each other and they all twist and turn around. So it's completely different than a cave like Kazumura, which is more or less just one big long tunnel without all this braided complications. And so one things we try and show on the map are partially, of course, where the entrances are. Then we also show where what we call leads are, where there's passages that remain to be explored. And maybe in this case, there's one that's 6 by 6 feet and goes for at least 100 feet. So that's kind of our working map, so we know what to go back in and start filling in more passages. And then, of course, we show cross-sectional views showing the ceiling height and what the passage shape looks like, and all kinds of other details, like the locations of bird bones, other interesting things for scientists to look at. And all of that also is going into a big GIS database that Elliot and Edith have started working on. So sort of the surveying project statistics, here's the number by a year since I became more heavily involved. And you can see that we're talking about initially not so many trips, but especially in 2019, I'm on almost every trip. Sometimes we have 2 teams, and I had at least 80 days of mapping caves up there in 2019. Then of course COVID slowed us down, but we're getting back to work again this year. And this number of miles of passage that we've surveyed is accumulating pretty steadily. So you can see by taking the ratio of miles to trips that typically on a good day we'll be able to map about 1,000 feet of passage. It just takes a lot of time to do all this work. So statistics, so above, Malca means above the highway, we have about, at least 65 miles of passageways now with over 1,000 entrances. Typically we'll find 2 or 3 new entrances on every trip out there, and maybe more, sometimes less. Below the highway there's at least 25 miles of passages and over 350 miles, 225 miles of cave. So one thing that's starting to become impressive, to me at least, is that if you add this up, it's over 15% of all the total mapped lava tube passages in Hawaii. And I was just looking at the list of mapped caves in the entire world. Well, it turns out that well over half of them, of the total length of all lava tubes that have been surveyed, are in Hawaii. So we're talking well over 5%, more like 10% of the entire length of all the lava tubes in the entire world are in this area. So it makes it very special and unique and worth preserving. There is lots of interesting geology questions that could be addressed, and just here's one of them. So these are flow names here. QH2 and QH3 are different ages. This QH3 is younger, and according to the geologic map, this flow goes right over the cave. But when we go through the cave, at least in this section, there's no evidence of this flow having poured into the cave openings. That's starting to change with some new passages that we found over to the right here. In this case, it looks like this flow did flow in and block these passages coming up underneath. So what it looks like is that the boundaries of this QH3 flow are not very accurate. And I've got an intern who's going to come out this summer and hopefully try and make a much better definition of these flow boundaries from USGS. Intern. Anyway, let's now have more fun and sort of tour around the caves. So first I'll show you sort of what the range of passage types is. This is kind of a typical larger passage. You can see all kinds of flow lines and interesting things in the ceiling, as well as roots coming down. Here's another larger passage. Note in this case the benches on the side. You get big benches from when the lava was not filling the cave, but it was partially filling it, and it started to actually slowly roof over, as you can see right below where the person's sitting. Again, we have lots of ferns and things in the entrances. In other cases, the floor is quite rough and a'a-like. That tends to happen in lower levels where there's cooling. And also we have unusual for lava tubes is a lot of stalactites hanging from the ceiling. And again, this is probably related to the steepness of the caves. There's one cave that has a skylight in it. This is actually a man-made skylight, and this cave has a wall in it as well, and it has latrines, and it was a designated civil defense cave, and there's still a sign next to it, which is very hard to spot, but in the old days they took some caves like this and outfitted them in case of nuclear war, that people could go in there and peacefully die from radiation underground instead of above ground. Anyway, it makes a nice sunbeam. There used to be a spiral staircase coming down, which is now collapsed. So that's a cave that's at about 1,800 feet elevation. That's the only civil defense cave I know of in this study area. So going back to the more typical caves, they're full of nice. When we're happy to see when the floor is smooth. This tends to be in upper level passages where the lava hasn't turned all rough, and you can see it's actually formed a tube in tube down at the bottom here. So here this channel got roofed over. In other areas the floor again turns very rough, but it can have different colors due to oxidation of different minerals. And here it looks like this like formation came down and went into a hole, and it's actually going down into a lower level passage that's underneath this passage. But again, the colors are very nice. It's not typical of most lava tubes to have such colorful lava. Another feature is you do have like a tube-in-tube passage formation here that you can see how the lava tubes can sort of form in a miniature way here, where they start accreting lava on the sides and can roof over. That's one of the 5 ways that lava tubes form. Anyway, that's a nice sort of medium-sized passage. This is one of the larger passages. This is an area of the cave that would be ideal for educational tours, probably, because it's very convenient and it's got some nice big passages. And this is right near where that Delissea tree was found originally. This is the passage below the highway. It doesn't look all that different. Again, nice reflective white coatings on the surfaces of the walls, which we'll show more of. And here's another example where the cave, instead of being black, it's almost white inside. And so all this whiteness is pretty much due to gypsum crystals, which have precipitated on the surface, and also the action of microbes. And so this is probably at least half of the cave is this small or smaller. Again, you can't quite walk in a passage like this, but there are places where you have to crawl on your belly, and in this case it was so tight to get through this breakdown choke that Doug had to hold his breath out to squeeze through. And luckily, percentage-wise, this is like less than 1% of the cave system, but time-wise, I'll tell you, you're traveling about 100 times slower than walking speed if you're lucky. Here's another crawlway. So most of these crawlways aren't too long. This particular one happens to go on for over 1,000 feet, so it's quite tedious to follow it. And you can see on the ceiling here is a lot of orange slime, and that's very interesting because it's formed by microbes, as I'll show in the next section after this one. So here's some pretty pictures about how lava can drip down from the ceiling. In this case, I just generically call them ceiling drips or shark's teeth, or anyway, the hot lava just dripped down and solidified as the cave was cooling. Sometimes it forms these amazingly delicate helictites. These are about the width of a water drop, and we call them helictites because helictite means defying gravity. In this case, it's extremely rare because it actually joined into a little dribble spire where the lava had dribbled down, formed a stalagmite, and then this helictite came down and joined into it. So this kind of formation is extremely delicate. You also get kind of blobby things where the lava came down and swirled around, and like toothpaste, squeezing out of a toothpaste. And in a few areas of the cave we have these dribble spire formations. Not super common in this cave system. And here we have a column that's all formed with dripping lava. And here's some of the an area of large stalactites hanging from the ceiling. And you can see that they've also been splashed up with splatter formations, which I'll spend more time on later. So again, these tend to be in the steep parts of the cave where the lava can splash up, hit the ceiling, and kind of hang there. We also get some really delicate stalactites. Some of them, as you can see from the scale of the water drip, are thinner than a drip of water. Very, very fine, with little bits of crystal coating them. Now here's a weird one. This is a coated tree cast. So there used to be a tree here. The tree got melted away or burned away when the lava flowed over it, and then it got coated. Now, if you look carefully inside, you can actually see sort of the remnants of some tree barks. So in one section of the cave, this tends to be a little bit more common. They're still not all that common, but it's one of the better interesting examples of these. These tree molds, by the way, can go back as much as 20 feet into the wall. And in one case, it goes all the way from one passage over to another passage. This is an area where the wind must have been very, very strong because as the lava was cooling, it was being blown around and then it turned to rock with these amazing wind patterns showing that they were being blown as the wind was letting them cool. And this is a detail of the tip of a stalagmite, sorry. You can see quite a few of these ones that are the size of a water drop. Amazingly enough, they are hollow inside and water can actually drip down and they'll make a steady drip coming out. And actually it seems like they're actually growing from the precipitation of the water as over time it's slowly working its way down and growing rock around the outside of making the tube longer and longer. And again, these are gypsum crystals that are precipitated on the top. So these are another example of those helictites, the wiggly things. These are about 6 to 10 inches long. They are extremely delicate. If you just look at them, they break almost. So very, very sensitive to vibrations. And again, they're in an environment where there's lots of white and orange slime. This is a extremely unusual one where it looks like a little flake of lava, maybe almost looks like a calcite raft sitting on maybe a pool or something, got stuck onto the bottom of a thin stalactite. I have no idea what it is, but I put a backlight behind it and you can see that it's translucent. And something I've never seen in a lava tube before or since. This is another pretty rare formation. It looks to me like it's a case where there were tree roots and over time they've been mineralized either by gypsum or calcite. And you can see there's a water drop there. So this is in water that's depositional. And so it's actually preserving the shape of some tree roots. It's pretty interesting. You also get lava falls and lava balls. So lava balls are what we call another name for a hot breakdown. When the cave is cooling, of course, bits and pieces can fall off of the ceiling and hit the floor, but if the lava is still flowing, they'll get coated. So we call this hot breakdown, and they can be nice and smooth and interesting. Sometimes they get stuck in the ceiling, and you get quite a profusion of them in this ceiling of this passage. There's another example of some. And once in a while, not so often in this cave system, we have a vertical or near vertical lava falls. This is much more common in Kazumura Cave, where you actually need ropes to go through the upper part of the cave. But here we occasionally have vertical lava falls. The longest one is maybe 20 feet, and they're all more or less climbable by really good climbers with a safety rope. There's another lava falls with some big tree roots hanging down. So a little bit about bones. Honestly, the most common thing that we find in the caves are cow bones. I've counted over 200 cow bone sets so far. Some of them even still have the tags on their ear. One of them had just died the day before. So cows seem to have this amazing propensity to fall into entrances, wander around for a little bit, and die. Probably have broken legs and things. And there's an example of a sheep or something, probably. So these modern ungulates are, let's say, a little bit, to my mind, polluting the cave with their carcasses. This is a pretty big pig skull. And what's interesting is it's been in the cave so long that it started growing crystals right out of the skull. I didn't know that crystals could grow out of bone, but yes, they do. So of more interest scientifically are these bird bones. This is so these are of the type that were studied by the Smithsonian Museum. They range from very, very small, like honey creepers, which are very hard to even spot. I think there's several different extinct honey creeper species which have been identified from these caves. These are, this looks like a petrel skull. They're not extinct, but they're threatened or endangered. We don't really see petrels very much anymore. And then this one is one of the examples of the Brantaruax. And I have some more. So Brantaruax is the large extinct Hawaiian goose that stood 2 to 3 feet tall, was flightless, and went extinct shortly after people arrived. And all we know about them is from the bones, and the caves in Pu'uawa are the primary site for well-preserved bones of the Brantaruax. And in fact, this section of the cave is named the Brantaruax section. So there's the breastplate, and then, well, there's a skull in there somewhere. There's a skull in this picture. And if you're interested in the Brantaruax or honey creepers, you can go to the Lyman Museum in Hilo, and they have an exhibit about them, which hardly anybody knows about. So continuing on with biology, almost done. There's a lot of tree roots in the areas where the roof of the cave is less than 2 or 3 meters thick. The tree roots from especially the ohia trees make their way into the caves. And since we don't have bats that live in the cave, this is the primary source of nutrition for all kinds of cave-adapted creatures, anywhere from tiny little isopods to wolf spiders. And so far, the crew that's working on cave biology has identified almost 60 different species that are cave-adapted. So here's a cave-adapted millipede, perhaps, and here's see there, it's white with no eyes. It's some kind of tiny little bug. And here's an example of cave-adapted millipedes and terrestrial millipedes mixed together. So there's ongoing studies. That's one of the main reasons to preserve these caves, is so we don't disturb the habitat for these critters that only live in the caves. There's also some interesting fungus formations. So we have all this orange slime, which is full of microbes that scientists love to study, and sometimes it flares up into big fungal mats like this one. Actually blows around in the wind. But you can see in some areas the cave is just absolutely coated with this orange slime. And so people like Dan and Northup have been studying it and find that it's actually composed of many different types of microbes, and we might be looking here at what life looks like on Mars, because this is the kind of environment on Mars that might have preserved life. And so now my last topic is just pretty pictures of splatters where the lava splashed up and made all kinds of amazing Jackson Pollock-like formations. This is a picture of just amazing splashes, and sometimes it turns different colors. So the lava is just coming down, splashing up, getting oxidized, and getting deposited on the walls, dripping down, and making astounding display of beautiful formations. And I have to say that other than Hualālai, there's another cave on Hualālai that's similar, but nowhere else in the world have I seen such a profusion of these amazing colorful splatters. So it's a very important and worthwhile thing to preserve. Just look at the delicacy of these things. This typical image is about a foot across. And it's so cool how the different states of oxidation of the iron make these 4 different colors. The green, the orange, the magenta, and the red. And just look at the delicate formations that have been preserved in time. Here's a whole wall just absolutely covered in these splatters. This is a detail of that same wall. And here's a detail of a sort of U-loop with a water drop for scale at the bottom. Look how thin this bit of crystal is here. It's just amazingly delicate and beautiful. And this is one of my favorite pictures that I just took 2 weeks ago of all ropey splatters all covered together, and just gorgeous, just gorgeous. So what's the value of all this research? I guess we say, well, we have the habitat for the rare fauna and the plants and trees and mosses and ferns. the habitat for the cave adapted species. Like I say, there's at least 60 bugs that have been identified that only live in caves, and some of them probably only live in the caves on Puawa. It's the habitat for these microbes that are found in the slimes and the bones of now extinct birds. We found many more than the Smithsonian knew about, so it'd be time for another crew to come back and perhaps resume that study. Of course, there's understanding why is this flow so complicated? Why is it so massively intertwined and complicated? What's the geology behind all of it? And what's the relationship to the forest above the cave? And what areas should be targeted for our next exclosures beyond the Hena Hena Preserve? And of course, part of the practical portion is to know where the passages go under roads and fences. And finally, great educational opportunities to tell people about the value of caves and the amazing resources they contain. And so again, thanks to some of the most frequent team members, just listed here briefly. And thank you to the Department of DOFA and the HETF for continuing to allow our crew to explore this wonderful and amazing cave system, and hopefully share our excitement with all of you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Peter. So we're going to open the floor to questions now. If anybody has any questions for Peter, we have the next 15 minutes for questions and discussion.
I have a question.
Sure.
So what is the depth of the cave at this point?
The vertical extent of the main Delissea system is about 5,000 feet, but it's not all quite connected together yet, so depends on how you count it. If you want to see the depth, the vertical extent of the passages that you can traverse without ever having to leave the cave and maybe do a short walk on the surface, then it's about 1,100 meters, whatever that is, 3,500 feet. But it's quite a large vertical extent as far as caves in the world go.
I have a question about, could you describe or explain a little more about the slime you keep referring to? Because there's things that grow in it, or how it forms in the first place and how it forms.
Well, I could try. So in the wetter areas, what you find is you touch the wall or even the floor and it's slimy. I mean, it's like goo, and what it is apparently is a combination of minerals and microbes. So the microbial, and sometimes you see it more just, you can actually really see the microbes because there's little dots and which make colonies, and you can see little trails. You can even see places where the different colonies have been battling it out for territory. And these microbes are a mixture of fungus and bacteria and actinomyces in some complicated ecosystems. And they're actually also interacting with the rock. And part of the slime comes from the microbes actually munching on the rock to get nutrition. So they need rock and water to survive on. And you end up with these slimy surfaces, which so these are kind of called extremophiles because these are microbes that live in extreme conditions. And that's why scientists are particularly interested in the ones in the caves, because if there is, say, life on other Mars, for example, like everyone's interested in right now, this is the kind of environment where life might have existed 3.5 billion years ago. It was probably similar to some slimes underground in an environment like this. So there's a lot of research going on. Diana has quite a few students. They do, DNA sequencing and look at the variations. So it's a fascinating field, and one which I don't know a whole lot about, except I put on the maps where we see interesting colors. For example, one area we found pink slime. So we brought Diana there and she said, oh yeah, that's a very unusual type of slime, all right, and had it analyzed and so on.
And if I can just add for they produce biofilms. So if you don't brush your teeth, you know how they're slimy in the morning? That's a biofilm. And the microbes produce a film like that into which they live. It's their house in a way.
Peter, can you hear me?
Yeah,
Just a comment. That's you've done great work up there, and you've with your mapping and kind of locating the number of holes that you have. It's really impressive. A comment on the photo you had of the ramp going down into the lava tube. I looked at that many times, and I always thought it was or I initially thought that it was a shelter cave. But after talking to the cowboys, they told me that oftentimes the cattle would fall in these lava tubes, as you mentioned, and sometimes they had to build ramps out of stone to go down and herd the animals back out. And I suspect that the picture that you have there is probably that situation, because if you go into that cave and look around, there's really no evidence, or at least I could see no evidence of any kind of shelter or, you know, evidence of people being in there. Anyway, they did build ramps in some of those skylights to get animals out when the animals were still alive.
thank you.
Peter, we have a question in the chat from Mary Metcalf. She's asking, how did you know that about the civil defense caves? Are they recorded somewhere?
I was told about that particular cave by Jack Lockwood, who's the author, well, was making a geologic map of the area. So he's the author of the book Volcanoes. There was a list of civil defense caves, but I cannot find a publication anywhere anymore.
Back in the 60s.
It was published in the 60s, and I don't have it, you know, so if you look online, I can't find it anywhere anymore. There was only about a dozen on the Big Island. It's not very many.
I have a map of those old civil defense caves, and you're right, it's no longer published. That particular one, I've always heard I've heard that it's called Maui Loa, the one with the outhouses in it.
Right.
But I don't know for sure if that's the real true name of it. But it does have evidence of a lot of human use in there, ancient human use with rock walls and other features.
That's right.
There's another question in the chat from Greg Lennon. He's asking, is LiDAR an appropriate mapping technology for these caves?
LiDAR has been used in lava tubes and in caves in general. It's not particularly appropriate because it's, at least until recently, it's expensive and time consuming. It can take maybe 10 times longer to use LiDAR than to do the kind of mapping we're doing. But that's slowly changing with much more lightweight LiDAR units. I think the more interesting wave of the future is photogrammetry techniques, where you basically go through the cave and take one photo every foot or so with a wide angle lens and stitch them all together into a complete 3D model from which you can make all the kinds of maps we make, but you can also fly through it and zoom in and see all the details. So it's kind of a combination of traditional mapping like I've been doing and traditional photography documentation like I've been doing combined together. So for example, one thing I do is when I take the photos, I key the location to the nearest survey station. So eventually we can put it all in the GIS system and people can say, look at, you know, the formations that I have pretty pictures of, they can know where it is in the cave. But for me, photogrammetry is still too expensive and time consuming to do on a cave like this. People have done it for smaller caves so far, and they've done LiDAR on smaller caves as well. But that's a good question. I think that's eventually these 3D mapping techniques will become more and more common. Also, they're not so good when you have to crawl on your belly and carry fancy equipment around.
Hi,
Awesome, Ms. Payne.
Peter.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead. I was
Oh,
gonna close
sorry.
it.
No, if somebody else had a question, go ahead.
No. Go ahead.
Oh, okay. Hi, my name is Avalon. I'm an archaeologist up at Hualālai training area. And I actually had two questions. First, I'm curious, do you folks have archaeologists come with you in the caves to map cultural items?
So generally no, but we do have, and let's say above the highway, I've been in the caves. There's actually 2 archaeologists who are on our team from time to time. And as John mentioned, we just have not seen much in the way of human archaeology above the highway. And below the highway, there is some, but not very much. And basically, we have a form from the SHPD that they gave us to fill in. And if we see anything significant, we fill in the archaeological report and send it to the Department of Historical Preservation.
Nice. Thank you, Peter. I appreciate that. And then my second question was, do you folks ever take interns or volunteers for your mapping expeditions?
Yes. I mean, we're totally self-funded, and this is basically a hobby that's turned into a career. But yeah, I do take interns, but not, you know, try from time to time. And if most people don't really like it that much, but every once in a while we find somebody who really loves this kind of work. So yeah, I am open, like for example, this summer, I'm going to take an intern who's a geology intern with USGS, and he's looking for something to do this summer. So we're going to try and look at the geology of in the forest bird sanctuary.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Peter. I appreciate it.
Yeah.
We have one more. I think we can take one more question. We have Eric Bilderback. Do you have a question, Eric?
Sure. This is Eric Bilderback. I work for the National Park Service and I'm a geomorphologist. So you mentioned in your conversation about 5 different ways of lava tube formation, and I wonder if you could just elaborate a little bit. You know, aside from crusting over, what are the other ways of formation?
Okay, well, briefly, I'll just describe the other major way. So the other most common is inflation. So you have a lava field that's flowing along, and then it gets plugged, and then the lava starts flowing under the crust and inflating the entire lava field. You know, I'm sure you know about this, how you can see them just puff up in a time-lapse photo. Now, if the plug breaks, that lava that's basically a very wide but not very tall layer of lava can drain out and leave a maze of very wide but crawly passages with lots of maybe columns in between and braided passages. And certainly in the case of the Puwawa, that's one of the big factors that's making it so complex. But we also have downcutting, you know, into traditional downcutting into channels. We have, anyway, so that's the main other way, you know, that besides crusting over.
Yeah, newest, oldest, or
Yeah.
oldest, newest.
So you'll end up with the roof of the cave being actually younger than or older than the part you're in. Anyway, it's kind of backwards, but that's funny. Yeah, so there's a paper on it. The first author is Stefan Kempe, that we wrote, and he tried to elucidate the other forms more clearly than I can do in this short time.
Thank you. I'll look for the paper.
Mm-hmm. So I think we're out of time for questions, but again, I'd like to thank everybody for your interest and also just make a little plug for the Cave Conservancy of Hawaii. We're a group that's, for now, based primarily down south in Ocean View. And as you saw, the caves have all kinds of rare and important features that we want to preserve, from anything from construction, from sewage, from overuse, from vandalism. And so if you're interested in finding out more about the Cave Conservancy of Hawaii, just Google it, and we have a web page, and which we hope to update in the future. And we're always looking for new members who might want to support the effort to preserve caves for posterity. Well, until the next lava flow. Okay.